3 rings for elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the dark lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all in, and in the darkness bind them, the land of Mordor, where the shadows lie. I should have grabbed my 1 ring for that, but I forgot to. But anyways, hello everyone, welcome to Williams Lyceum. I'm your host Liam, aka Hembar, and today I want to talk about poetry. So I probably recited the most, or read rather, the most famous fantasy poem, well, probably of all time. And when we think of fantasy and poetry, we probably think of Tolkien. I'm going to guess most of you think of Tolkien. And you're probably not thinking of, a lot of you probably aren't thinking of anyone else. So maybe you'll think of someone like Steven Erikson. He is someone who has still put some poems in his books, so something I appreciate. This is not really like a deep dive. I just basically, I like poetry, okay? I like writing poetry, I like reading poetry. For those unaware, I partake in Poetry Thursday. Every Thursday I share a poem. And I actually, just the other day, recorded The Hashes Eater by Clark Ashton Smith. That'll be coming out next week, actually. And it's easily the longest poem ever recorded. It took me 25 minutes. Like the recording is 25 minutes, so it took me longer than that. But I like poetry, and I want to just kind of look at it a little bit in its view in fantasy. And in a way, it's not that popular in fantasy, and maybe that's because most authors aren't poets. I mean, poetry is hard, it's difficult, it is not the same as writing prose, right? So, like I said, Steven Erikson is like one person that comes to mind when I think of books that come out and have poetry in them. Um, you know, to this day, well, actually, I haven't read anything super new by Erikson because I'm still making my way through Book of the Fallen, but I assume that maybe there's poetry in his new stuff as well. But I was actually just reading through a collection of short stories by David Wiley, and there's one section in there specifically taking down Goliath's before last story, and it is a poem, and it is a story as well. So, I mean, when I think of like speculative fiction and poetry, the only book that comes to mind with sci-fi is The Green Millennium, which I just recently read. There might be some other sci-fi book out there that has poetry in it. I guess technically there's a song, I believe, in one of the volumes of Book of the New Sun, and that's science fantasy as well. So it's typically more in fantasy, and I think I have a kind of a guess why, but I'll mention that in a minute. So like I said, I mentioned David Wiley, Steven Erikson, and Tolkien, of course, is this big one. I know some people are probably watching this who are like, I skip over all the poems in Tolkien, and shame on you. No, I'm just joking. You can do that if you want, obviously. I like the poems. I think it lends a fun aspect to it because, well, basically because they're part of that world, right? So it helps for the immersion, I think. But I think also if you're looking at Tolkien, you'd want to mention someone like William Morris, who has more poetry, probably arguably, in his works than Tolkien does, especially since some of Morris's works are just straight up poems. I realize some of Tolkien's are as well, but I don't know if any of those were published in his lifetime. I think all of his works that are just like lays and stuff like that got published after he had passed. So he wrote it, of course. And we have something like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, which have poems in them. But we also have Robert Jordan. I'm not a huge fan of Jordan, but he does have, I believe, an occasional poem. Maybe they're more of like epilogues of sorts. There's the one about riding on the winds of the rising storm, I believe, is from the Crossroads of Twilight, which is literally the best part of that book because that book is pretty bad. But this nice little poem, I believe that it's at the end, is pretty nice. And I think of Clark Ashton Smith, who I don't know if he ever included poetry. Yeah, I haven't read a ton by Smith. I've really liked what I've read, but I'm not sure he ever included poetry in his fantasy writing, his horror kind of, whatever you want to call it, sword and sorcery, dark fantasy stuff. But he's a big poet. In fact, I like Smith more for his poetry than I do just for his like fiction. There's prose fiction rather. It's similar with Morris. I actually like Morris's prose romances, even though like something like The House of the Wolfings, the first prose romance by Morris, is I would say largely more poetry than prose. But then you have someone like Robert E. Howard, who actually is quite a good poet. I would say he's not like the best, but I like a lot of his poems. I share some of those actually on my channel. Same with H.P. Lovecraft, who isn't, again, I would say isn't the best poet ever, and neither is Fritz Leiber. But even like he's the one guy who wrote Green Millennium, the one sci-fi book I could think of. But he even has the occasional poems in his other stuff, very occasional. He is a Shakespearean like actor actually, so that's not super surprising. But I think when we look specifically at this relationship with fantasy and poetry, if you look at Morris and Dunsany even as well, they're some of the more important figures. In particular because Morris is his recreation, his point of his prose romances, right, um, are a recreation of medieval romance, uh, chivalric romance. That is what he's trying to do. And because he didn't like modern society and yada yada, but Morris is in large part where we get at least the Tolkien avenue of fantasy is in large part from Morris. Um, I think I would need to do more of studying on my own, honestly, but I've seen one source claim that his third prose romance, The Story of the Glittering Plain, is the first fantasy story to be set in a secondary world. If that's the case, then it's very obvious how he's important in that case. But he's important regardless. He is like one of the biggest influences on Tolkien. I would recommend you go and read him. I like Morris a lot. He's definitely not for everyone though. He's very archaic and poetic. But it's this recreation of this medieval that he's trying to do that I think is kind of important, right? Because if you go and read many medieval works, they're poetry. There's a lot. There's some in prose as well, right? But like stuff like The Song of Roland or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, Piers Plowman, Beowulf, The Canterbury Tales, that's all poetry. Different styles of poetry depending on what language it is, but it's all poetry still. You have other older works, of course, including like Homer's stuff, which is poetry, epic poetry, and then Mahabharata as well, which I'm pretty sure is poetry, but I don't know. I think they're couplets actually. Anyways, but something like Lamort d'Arthur, for example, isn't obviously poetry. I think Lamort d'Arthur is later than everything else I mentioned as well, though. But I mean, some of Lamort d'Arthur's predecessors are, right. So you have the stanzaic Mort Arthur and the alliterative Mort Arthur, which is spelled slightly different, by the way, than the stanzaic one. But those are stanzaic, alliterative, they're poetry. And I think it's these historical texts, and these are historical texts, right? We think of that stuff in the past, right? Just like Morris was. I think that's why fantasy uses this poetry, or does sometimes. It doesn't a lot, obviously. That's kind of one thing that didn't survive a ton, even though it's cool that you had both avenues of fantasy, like Robert E. Howard's Sword and Sorcery and Tolkien's epic fantasy. They're both poets, which is cool. Poetry is a manly thing. I guess you could say it's virtuous, right? No. Anyways, the Vikings like poetry, but I think it's that connection to history, right? Which is kind of where this idea of where we get. Like those works I mentioned, they're not fantasy, you know what I mean? But it's that they're very important for the fantasy genre, and that connection to a history, it makes these fantasy works have more authenticity, right? So if they're poetic, maybe that's more authentic. And not only that, is that it makes the world more authentic because these poems are generally stories about that world, right? So it makes the world feel more real, right? There's a verisimilitude that you can get from having poetry in the secondary world. Besides that, I just wanted to say that poetry is awesome. This is no deep dive, just some quick, brief thoughts. I'm curious if y'all like the poems. If in stuff like the Lord of the Rings, that's probably the biggest example, that most people or a large amount of fantasy fans have read. And then if not, like, if you don't like them, then maybe why? Because poetry is basically just song, you know what I mean, in some sense. So what's wrong with you? But then also, like, I would invite you, if you haven't already, to explore maybe some other speculative fiction authors, like fantasy, science fiction, horror authors that are also poets. I mean, like, you could go and read Lovecraft's poetry, Robert E. Howard's, Clark Ashton Smith, and honestly, like, for me, I've always been a big fan of Tolkien's poetry, but I would put Tolkien as like maybe my third favorite speculative fiction like poet. I would put William Morris above him. Like William Morris is just a better poet, and I would put probably Clark Ashton Smith above Morris because I just think Smith is one of the most imaginative people to ever touch the genre. If you think Michael Moorcock is weird, you need to read some Clark Ashton Smith because that guy is insane. If you think Gene Wolfe is hard to read, you need to read Clark Ashton Smith because that guy's vocabulary is insane. Morris's vocabulary is different as well. In fact, if you think Tolkien's archaic, then Morris is way more archaic, actually. And so, I mean, these guys teach me words, which is half the reason I like them. But anyways, that's just my brief thoughts on fantasy, poetry. Do you think my assumption as to why it was kind of important makes sense? I don't really have a reason why it's not so important besides the fact that poetry is hard. And, not everyone wants to take the time to be a poet. And it's not really considered much of a virtue these days. Like, they don't really make you write poetry in class. I don't think I ever had to write a poem besides like a haiku, right? Which is pretty easy in some senses. You know what I mean? To do it in okay, at least it's pretty easy. I'm sure it'd take more to master a haiku. But anyways, those are my thoughts. As been Liam Weems Lyceum. I hope you're having a great day, a great week. I'll catch you next time.